Dennis.
He's hanging up there.
But this kid, she and Tony get a divorce.
He and Joe Sherman.
We're ready to get started.
Just great guys.
We've mentioned the tape, and for your information, they will be available in the libraries from in each city. And if you'd like to order one from your city or individually, there's a form at the desk where we signed in afterwards. So you can put an order in for that also. And again, to repeat, we hope that the cities will make very good use of this for people that are not here. Now we have a free-for-all. We have quite a pile of good questions, I'm told. And the first team has already been introduced. They're familiar to you. But introducing the referee this afternoon. Karen Strasser-Kaufman is our official. We don't have a striped shirt for you, but we know that you can handle it. As a political scientist by training, a long-term college professor by profession, a two-term Monterey County supervisor by election, and a community activist by choice. He is frequently asked, I'll stop there, I should have paused, I'm sorry. Frequently asked to mediate on local and regional issues. She currently serves on the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council, where she represents the public at large and serves on the boards of the Monterey Youth Museum and Friends of Moss Landing Marine Laboratories. Karen and her husband Richard reside in Carmel Valley, and we'll turn the next session over, which is questions and answers, to Karen Strasser-Kaufman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm honored to be asked to participate in what is a really, really critical issue for our region. We're going to make this session as efficient as possible and try to have a little bit under an hour for your questions to be answered. I will encourage, obviously, as many answers as possible, but try to restrain yourself. If it's been answered by one or two, we'll try to move on. I do want an opportunity for everyone to have their questions answered, or at least close to answered. With that proviso, I've gone through quickly with the help of several others and bundled your questions. So your question may not be asked just the way you phrased it, but hopefully we'll get to the intent and you will get an answer. So we'll do that, and if we have time, we'll get to some of the very specific questions, but I've put them into categories, and I hope that will work for us. Before we begin, let me say that I have a very personal interest in the topic. Aside from being a resident here and sharing your concerns, as you probably know, I came to this country as an immigrant after the Second World War, and it was a very long time before I could return or afford to return to Germany, where I grew up and was raised. And when I finally was able to, I rushed, of course, back to the family house, got off the train, went down the large avenue, tree-lined, the beautiful corner brick home where my mother grew up and where I was born, and discovered, to my horror and despair, a McDonald's in that very location. So much for the despair of not having historic preservation in time. On the other hand, I just returned from a trip in Germany this summer, visiting with my family on my father's side, and again, as so many times in the past, visited my father's parental home in a little one-street village in the Black Forest. And with the passing of my aunt this year, that has now become a family responsibility. Fortunately for me, I have a very large family. Unfortunately for that house, it's a very large family with lots of different opinions on how to proceed. This is the first time the house has been unoccupied in over 400 years. And it is historic, and it is under preservation and protection and regulations and rules, and the outside can never be changed, and the inside should be changed as little as possible, although it's never been modernized. So it will be a challenge and a tremendous expense for whoever takes it on. On the other hand, I have the certainty that unlike my mother's house, My father's house will always be there for me and my children when we return to see, just as it was when I was growing up. And that's really the goal of historic preservation, is to share that atmosphere with future generations. So let me begin now. I will take, let me also say, a number of you had personal questions about your property, and you gave some details and some, how should this be handled, or what will the city do. In each of those cases, you will really need to check with your respective cities. And the planning representatives are here today. Maybe you can catch them during the reception to follow this session. And if not, obviously make an appointment with the planning department in your city and talk to them. I don't think we can take it up here. But if your question relates to something more general, I'll try and incorporate it. One question that has come up in a number of different ways basically runs something like this. What if a structure is so dilapidated or decomposed or neglected that it really cannot be restored? It really cannot be touched up. What happens to the historic status? And at what point does that determination kick in? When do we say it's just too damaged? We cannot rebuild it. Can somebody answer that question? Who would like to start?
Well, I want to start with a definition that would help, I think. And that is, when we talk about a historic property, we talk about its significance, but we also talk about its integrity, and not Don's, although sometimes we do discuss that. But to what degree does the building retain its integrity as a structure and its character-defining features? So that you can have a property that is significant but has lost its integrity and therefore is no longer considered to be a contributing building, or is one that can be considered for removal or demolition. That it's not that it has stopped being old or stopped having associations with a period of significance, but it no longer has the ability to help convey that period of significance because of the degree of loss or deterioration that's occurred. That's the starting point.
I'd like to say that it relates particularly to Section 106 review, and I just want to talk a little bit more about that. Actually, I think one case might make the point that the James Johnston house in Half Moon Bay was a salt box that was brought around the Horn in a ship and was erected up on the plains south of Half Moon Bay. It had been vacant for about 60 years and was in the midst of being restored. A lot of it had been burned. It was jacked up so they could build a foundation. A windstorm came by and blew the thing down into pickup sticks. That's when the owners phoned us. And we ended up going out there and tagging with paint every piece and gently taking it apart and laying it out on the ground and using historic photographs and the existing materials, and then going and finding other barns in the area that had heavy timbers. We reconstructed the building back the way it was, and now it is sitting in Half Moon Bay, painted white, and it's the White Lady on the Hill. So it depends on how much you love and care about something, how much of an effort you're going to put into it. Secondly, I think it may depend on how important it is relative to other structures. That Mount Vernon was nearly destroyed and was in very poor condition before it was restored. And it's gone through several generations of restoration work. And I think you might say that that would be a case where you really should put as many resources as necessary to preserve the building. So I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that question.
Anyone else wish to?
I would just add that in terms of a building being historic or not based on integrity is an issue that I think is part of that question. And at least to be eligible for the National Register, and we've discussed this a little bit today, properties have to retain their integrity. And in applying National Register criteria, there's some variation depending on why a building is significant. If it is significant for design, for example, the aspects of integrity most important to design, workmanship and materials are very important. So buildings may or may not be eligible based upon a lack or a retention of integrity. So.
Who determines that it's too badly gone?
A consultant like me.
Well,
No, I would think that there's federal criteria with respect to integrity, and an evaluation of condition is usually the part of any survey of historic resources.
All right.
Excuse me, just to jump in quickly. I think there actually is some value to having a consultant come in to help a decision like that. If it's a very sensitive, politically volatile, if this community is split over that kind of issue, I think a lot of times if someone like Bruce or Robert, for example, or Nori were to submit a report, that is something that a lot of acceptance about the fate of a building. We've done that several times in Pasadena, so it isn't on the shoulders of city staff or of a commission. I think that just to get acceptance from across the political spectrum.
And who pays for the consultant?
The city would probably pay in those cases.
Okay. Another set of questions deals with the issues of property rights and taking, and asks, is there compensation for unwilling owners of historic structures or sites if they wish to get out and let somebody else do it?
Does that mean you're looking at me?
Well, yes. I'm always looking at you, Norman.
I've got to give you the Jack Kidder answer, maybe. or the classic legal analysis, it depends. Taking is the ultimate sanction, the ultimate property owner remedy, and as in most cases, ultimate things are applied by the law only when you reach the ultimate stage. Taking will occur if truly, under all of the rubric of the definitions of the cases that deal with that constitutional issue, the property has been taken. Much more frequently, the property owner is going to have to deal with the limitations and restrictions on use that are part of the land use process. And that's where the issues of due process and fundamental fairness and everyone being involved in the process along the way are important.
I might add a little that the Penn Station case was one probably 10 or 15 years ago that really made the case that a property owner had a right to a reasonable rate of return, not necessarily the highest and best and most maximum use that they could make, and that went to the Supreme Court. Last year there was a case in Texas, I think it's Beaumont, and I may not have the exact city right, where a church was making the case that because they were a landmark, they were not permitted to use their property the highest and best use, and they went after separation of church and state and zoning, and that was also tossed out by the Supreme Court. So I think you have to be able to prove that there really is a substantial taking before it is a legitimate argument, that the normal course of land use planning allows for some variation in how and what is permitted to a piece of property and not the ultimate and best.
I'd like to follow. You complete?
Oh, I just want to give a rejoinder. I was about to butt in, but go right ahead.
I want to follow a comment that Nolan made, and having worked with attorneys for many years, I guess I have to work around the answer of the maybe a little bit. This is a sensitive issue, and it's one that I've dealt with many years in the land use area, and have testified in several trials having to do with diminution of property values and whether in fact there's a regulatory taking as opposed to a direct action of condemnation, civil rights issues and so forth. The area that I see here in historic properties and government's overlay of, I won't say intervention, but in the intent of attempting to protect things for the public, many times there in fact is a taking, and there's a taking of property rights. And when I mentioned that these things are in degrees, there are extremes in that area. And with respect to commercial properties, for instance, I could foresee in some of these areas that we're talking about in the historic overlay district in Cannery Row, for instance, if in fact there are view sheds to protect the public's right to see something that's historic that affects an intervening property or what have you, there are some very tangible means by which you can measure that loss. Now, whether the property owners down there will be compensated for that thing or not, I suppose is part of maybe what you're attempting to do in the incentive programs. And while I don't want to sound negative all the time, and I'm not a On the other extreme, I'm not a closet preservationist. I was participating for many years with the Palo Alto Stanford Heritage. I, like you, enjoy to see those things preserved. I think it's wonderful that you have philanthropic parties who will preserve those things, but not everybody can do so economically. And so I would just say that those losses can occur, and they can be substantial, and they're any degree of loss. And to the extent that the public body can offer incentives by any number of means, not necessarily monetarily, I think that would solve the problem.
Thank you. And you were going to add?
Oh, I was just going to be a little bit facetious, if I could, for a minute, and that is that some planners have raised the opposing question, which is if an owner is to be compensated for a reduction in value, which I understand is not a taking but a reduction in value, will the city also be share in the increase in value that it has helped establish by placing protections in place, by investing in infrastructure, by investing in a society and a culture that provides the value of that place, as Don pointed out this morning? It's odd that it seems to be perceived as a one-way compensation street.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next set of questions, just an additional one that dovetails with this. Why do the state and national register programs require private property owners' consent prior to designation on their respective registers?
I can't say why. I can say that particularly in relation to the California statute, it's an interesting process. The process is that property owner consent is required as a part of a hearing process almost that's created by statute. And then the statute goes on to say that if the property owner does not consent, you go on another list in which you're deemed to be eligible for a listing. And it's a little hard to see much of the distinction as you look at the rest of the law between being deemed eligible for listing and being deemed listed, at least particularly in relation to the California Environmental Quality Act. The effects are exactly the same. In most cases, I would expect that the property owner consent element is a threshold element to avoid the taking issue, and is very important in the construction of the statute to assist in creating the partnership between the property owners, who are certainly significant stakeholders, along with the government and the community as a whole in what is going on with preservation of property.
I might add a little that the ownership consent really came about fairly recently, and for a long time the register didn't have owner's consent, and it was really a political faction that caused the owner consent. The other issue regarding actually being on the register versus not being on the register and being determined eligible is if you want to take the carrot of the 20% investment tax credit, you must be actually listed on the register. You can't just be determined eligible. So there's also the benefit of trying to put something on the register for getting a value.
Grant, if I may, there is, I think, one other element that should be considered as we talk about the ultimate sanction, the legal process in its final application. Rarely, if ever, would, I think, one see a lawsuit involving a taking that just alleged a taking. The attack on the process by a landowner is going to attack it from every possible angle, and there the issues of due process are going to be significant. To the extent the owner of the property is excluded from the process or is not treated fairly in the process, isn't given a fair hearing, the government governmental agency may find itself losing in the litigation, even if it doesn't get to the issue of taking.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I was wondering where the question was, where it would be most appropriate to throw it in, but I think maybe it's here, is when Mr. Kennedy was talking about these two fundamental principles of law, that of fairness and that of certainty as kind of underlying strengths. I hadn't thought of it because I'm not a lawyer in that legal term before, but those two concepts absolutely impact on the effectiveness of local historic districts to positively affect property values. In the Indiana study, in the particular case study will go unnamed, but the place where there was the least positive impact on value, it didn't have a negative impact, but it had the least positive impact, was when there was a preservation commission that had no written guidelines, they had no staff. Some poor landowner schmuck would come before 5 white guys sitting at the commission and say, well, can I do this? And they'd kind of argue between them. Well, I think you should. No, I think they shouldn't. And the poor guy would walk away with uncertainty. There was a great deal of, I would suggest to you, very legitimate property owner resentment of that process. Has two then impacts. One, it had no positive impact on value because those things were missing. The fundamental fairness was missing and the predictability was missing. And to turn that around, when you have written guidelines, clearly understood, when you have staff that explains what this means versus what that means, when you have educational outreach by the Preservation Commission to the community, that's not only when you start meeting the tests of dependability and fundamental fairness, but that's also the correspondence to that, is that's also when you have significant positive benefits on property values.
Thank you. A general question, what is the distinction in law between old and historic? Are there levels of significance? Is there a hierarchy? And how do aspects of integrity play into the levels of significance? What if a building is just old or, quote, worthy of note, unquote, but not historic? Someone want to take a stab at that?
You want me to, yeah, that's one question. The National Register criteria, which is probably the easiest and most standardized around the country, allows for 3 levels of significance: at the local level, the statewide level, and the national level of significance. And many buildings that are at the national level of significance then become National Historic Landmarks, which is the highest level. An old building is just old. It doesn't necessarily have any historic value. And then you have to get into the criteria of, it may be historic. Is it important because Robert Louis Stevenson lived and created there, or is it work of Frank Lloyd Wright? There's different types of criteria for what is going to make it historic, and then how much of what is there remains, which we've already discussed in terms of character-defining features. If there are none remaining, then maybe it will not be on the National Register at any one of these levels. So I think that's really the threshold that one has. And again, it may be that the consultants or the State Office of Historic Preservation ultimately will be the determining body that makes that decision.
You know, think, if you will, of a farmhouse out in the field. And we can tell from its construction that it is at least 70 years old. But we have no other information about it. We know nothing about the history of that valley or that farmland. We know nothing about the people who once lived in that area. The building is of indistinguished design and craftsmanship. It can't convey or tell us anything about the culture or the history or the people that were there. It's old, but it's not able to convey any information. And without our being able to associate it with some of that information, it doesn't have significance. The moment we discover, though, that is where Truman grew up, or that is where Bill Gates was born, all of a sudden it may take on a new kind of significance. Or if we discover that's where winter red wheat was introduced into the breadbasket of America, then all of a sudden that farm takes on significance. Or when we discover that it is a representative of a dozen of those built by a particular group of immigrants who came to that valley, then it takes on significance. So it's the association of age with some information that it can impart to help link us to our past, as Brian Rosath was talking about so eloquently this morning, I think, that gives it that sense of significance. Link that then with its degree of integrity. Is there enough of the structure left there to help us understand that period in time? And then you've got a significant property.
The legal issue is that there is no legal definition of old versus historic. What the law does is provide a set of criteria by which factual determinations may be made. And that's what creates the lack of certainty and the ambiguity. The California statute, which is simply copies the National Historic Register criteria, defines 4 basic criteria. If it meets any one of them, it can be determined as historic. And that's either it's associated with some significant event, or it's associated with some significant person, or it has distinctive characteristics, or it yields important information related to history. Now, those are very amorphous criteria. And this is unfortunately not the level of science that's going to put someone on the moon. It rather is a spectrum through which people in the process have to make a balancing determination on, is this historic?
I think, though, that in fact there are the National Register bulletins and standards and a whole slew of past nominations that one could look at, sort of like, I guess, in the legal profession of case law. And that is one of the reasons that people are recommended to choose the National Register criteria when selecting the criteria for making a designation setup for a community, because there is so much information that has been developed over the years.
Any other comments on that? Then we'll move on. There are a number of questions, many questions, in fact, that deal with procedural issues. How are the cities going to make the determination? How are they going to train their staff? What process will be followed? One question that has arisen several times is, at what point could an administrative determination be made rather than having the process go through the various commissions and the Planning Commission and the Council? Who would like to take a stab at that?
I'll do a real quick one because I do not work with, my role in life is not particularly working with commissions, so there's lots here better to answer that than I. But I think that as commissions mature and the staff becomes more competent on a broad range of issues, that in fact more and more of kind of basic decision making is delegated down to the staff level. Now, that would rarely preclude somebody not liking the staff's decision and going to the commission, but it's really a kind of fast-tracking way to say, this issue about some stupid paint color on the front door and goofy stuff like that, why in the hell do you have to wait around a month for a commission hearing to listen to that kind of stuff? And I think that the more advanced, and Indianapolis is a great example, there's a whole range of kinds of issues, certainly not all of them, certainly not the most crucial, but a whole kinds of kind of routine decisions that both the staff is kind of empowered to help the applicant, here would be the best kind of approach, and then to really approve it without having to go through the whole full-blown thing.
I might say that since Jeff is sitting next to me, I can embarrass him, but if you looked at the way Jeff talked today, of talking about styles and character-defining features and knowing architects, 20 years ago, most planners wouldn't be able to do that. And I think there's been a radical change in planning education and maturity of how people are looking at older and historic buildings, to where you have a lot of people like Bruce Kibbe and Jeff that are in positions where they're reviewing things, where they actually have an incredible amount of knowledge and information on dealing with historic resources that was not the case 20 years ago. So I think that is sort of backing up what you're saying, that in fact you have some very knowledgeable people in planning positions.
I would just like to add that I think that there's an opportunity for staffs of cultural heritage landmark commissions to get greater knowledge of what to do in a design review case. There's not a lot of training available for those staff people, or frankly for commissioners when they come on to commissions. There's very often no guidebook when a commissioner is appointed, and I think that probably at least on a statewide level we should encourage more training of staff and commissioners so that they have tools to achieve the public-private partnership that I discussed before, because I think if the training is there and they know where the codes and regulations which Bruce mentioned are well tested over time, where those apply and where they don't, and how to balance strict enforcement of the code with the sort of economic development or private property rights that are achieved through cooperation. I think that comes through education of both the staff and the commissioners.
Just quickly, I think there's needs to be a cautionary note about staff reviews that occasionally staff members become too regulatory. They're too much of an advocate for historic preservation, and some of their interactions with developers and property owners don't really have the light of public scrutiny and being answerable to commissions or to the community. And that's just it's a footnote to all this, but it needs to be kept in mind as well.
I wanted to add that in terms of what Robert was saying, California Preservation Foundation, of which I left this list out of publications, also it's a statewide preservation organization, also does a series of workshops around the state, and at least once a year in North and Southern California, there is a workshop for design review commissioners and historic preservation commissioners. So you might want to look out for that. It generally is publicized fairly heavily in the local preservation newsletters and so on. And it's a wonderful series of workshops that has been going on for probably 15 years on a regular basis. So there is some chance of getting some education.
And let me just follow. The National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, in collaboration with the Park Service and the National Trust over the past 3 years, has been developing a model curriculum for training for preservation commissioners, has conducted it in a few states. We are actually presenting that training curriculum next Saturday in Denver at the first ever national meeting of preservation commissioners. And it will be taking a roadshow form soon. I think what everyone has underscored here is that a design review system requires maintenance, and that education is a part of that maintenance. I've often said that the design review component of a preservation program is the Maserati of planning tools. It looks really great on the showroom floor, but you better be able to afford the mechanic that comes along with it. And design review is that. It takes care and feeding and maintenance, either staff and or regular and frequent training of the commission. And so communities that do take on this responsibility, we've talked about many of the benefits today, there is a serious responsibility to maintain that system so that it will continue to be fair and predictable.
Let me dovetail one question on that. What are the pros and cons as to whether a city's historic preservation group should be an advisory body to the planning commission or a commission? I assume the question means, or an independent commission, rather than advisory to the planning commission. Anybody want to?
Is it a local preservation group?
Yes.
The local commission, preservation commission.
Should it be an advisory body to the planning commission and to be part of that hierarchy, or should it be an independent commission? I'm assuming a stronger commission.
In the city of Pacific Grove, we proved that there are no molehills. Everything is a mountain. The historic process, I believe, at one time got its start. Whether it was, say, a house was going to be demolished was an administrative decision, and then that might be appealed to the planning commission, and then these gigantic problems would develop. So as a response to that, that's where the Historic Resource Committee was created to start this process out with a sort of a volunteer citizen organization to become educated and make these kinds of decisions. And a great deal of the discussion was whether this committee should advise on demolitions, whether this committee should advise on granting of variances in order to create historic preservation and all these kinds of issues. And I can't quite remember what all the decisions were, but it kind of got divided up a little bit between all the groups, I think, and sort of that let everybody get their hand involved so that all the issues are covered.
Okay, another process question that relates to these answers. Can a structure's historical significance be determined without an analysis of its historical context within the city?
That's your barn again.
You have to have an analysis.
You do have to be able to put it into some sort of a context. You have to understand how important that particular association is in the community. If the house is associated with the development of winter red wheat, is different from the fact that it may have just been associated with farming in the region. And without knowing that, it's very, very difficult to assess the significance of a property. I don't know.
I think in a rare instance, if you're looking at architectural significance, the first Church of Christ Science designed by Bernard Maybeck in Berkeley would be on anybody's list wherever it was. But that's pretty rare, I think. And if it was the school that Bernard Maybeck first learned to draft in, you probably need to know an awful lot more about it before you can put it into its context.
I think buildings are only, or resources are only significant within a historic context. So the historic context really needs to be defined first, because it's the benchmark by which the level of significance of the resource is judged.
Thank you. Very specific procedural question. It has been stated by several panelists that the key to a sustainable historic preservation program is a complete survey based on reasonable criteria. The question to the City of Monterey, the City of Monterey has authorized an incomplete, non-binding survey of Cannery Row. When will the City of Monterey begin the complete survey of Cannery Row, and what will they do to assure public buy-in? Is there anybody?
Fortunately, there's no one up here representing the city. Who's the mayor? Who's the mayor?
I don't represent the city, but we've been working on the survey, so I'm not sure when you say binding survey or not what that means, because I'm not sure there is such a thing as a binding or non-binding survey. You either know the information and have the facts, or you don't. What you do with the facts is a different set of questions. And it's very difficult unless you have a complete survey of all resources to make an intelligent decision. But I think that a lot of people get confused with the idea that somehow you need to know how you're going to use the survey before you do it. And in fact, you need to separate those two questions, get the facts out of what is involved in the survey, whether it's a small survey or a large survey. After that is done, then you can decide how you're going to use the survey or not. So I'm not exactly sure about the question, but I think any time you do a survey of whatever you do is better than not doing anything, and the more you do is better.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. There are other process questions, but I think you can get those answered perhaps a little bit more simply by the respective planning departments. There's some very interesting questions about what values are considered worthy of protection, and let me just see if I can summarize several of them. What if the site is not a building? What if it happens to be a cemetery of historical significance where there was burial of old California families, pioneering immigrants, etc.? Another question is, what about maritime resources? What about railroad equipment, farm implements, other types of non-structural values that need to be preserved rather than a building or a particular locale? And let's see. How would the historic Monterey Purse Seiner, the Western Flyer, benefit from the type of programs that are being discussed today? And this is the vessel that Steinbeck and Ricketts sailed in exploring the Sea of Cortez. So perhaps we can lump these together and try to get an answer.
Well, I hope nobody's looking at me for any of this stuff, because I have to say that, and I do not mean to demean preservation more broadly than buildings. I will acknowledge that there's lots of reasons that everybody on this stage is more articulate about than I. The reality is, and some kind of lunatic Civil War battlefield nut will probably just argue with this, but my little narrow area of the kind of economic significance of preservation will certainly be less demonstrable on some old plow than it will be on a building. Now, that does not say that it ought not be saved and that it ought not be preserved and there's not appropriate preservation. It is just the kind of
I represent the Plow Owners Association.
You kind of look like a plow owner kind of guy to me.
He has 106 reasons for
Well, that was a multi-part question. Cemeteries are generally not considered using National Register criteria. In rare instances, if there is a mausoleum designed by Louis Sullivan, then that might be on the register, but not places where somebody is interred is typically not allowed. There are some exemptions, but they're fairly rare. And movable objects can be admitted or listed on the National Register, and there are many of them. The National Trust has a sub-organization having to do with maritime preservation, and so there's a large group of people very interested in restoration of ships, and they are listed on the National Register. There's probably a couple other pieces I missed in there.
Maritime Resources was one.
Yeah, maritime resources are listed, and the National Maritime Museum in San Francisco has a whole variety of ships that are actually listed on the National Register.
Well, the city of Pacific Grove bought a piece of property through a vote that was bought because it has habitat for butterflies. And on that piece of property, there is a historic dwelling that is now part of yet again, another controversy in the city of Pacific Grove as to how to deal with that piece of property.
Yeah, actually, when you were reading the question, I was thinking that Native Americans find that there are natural outcroppings that are very important to their culture, that they think are very important, that have no archaeological remains and no built remains, and in some cases nothing other than a geographic form. So I think it depends on the culture and on the level of what you're looking at and in what criteria you're using when looking at something.
Thank you. Also, a bunch of questions on incentives, and if I can try to pull those together and get one set of answers. Can design approval fees and/or building permit fees be waived for historic resources? What are the three most successful incentives in the residential area for restoration? Who qualifies for grants, whether city, state, or federal, and for what purposes? And then there's a question, I think it's related. Does Monterey's and Pasadena's ordinance on historic preservation program allow the staff flexibility to negotiate incentives with property owners in order to ensure a balance between protection and economic development? So the issue of incentives and who benefits and who negotiates and how it can be done. Could we have some response?
Well, one program, which is the Mills Act in California, is probably one of the strongest incentives available, particularly for residential property owners that don't fall under use of the investment tax credit, the federal investment tax credit. The Mills Act is state enabling legislation that allows local communities to adopt some form of property tax abatement. It's based upon an individual city's application of the state enabling legislation, so it can vary. But the reduction in property taxes is intended to be based upon use of those equivalent funds towards rehabilitation of a historic building, and throughout California it has varied. In the city of Los Angeles, only city designated monuments are eligible for use of the Mills Act property tax reduction incentive. So property has to be designated locally. It doesn't matter that a property might be listed in the National Register. It has to be designated locally. But it's been a very successful program in a short few months. So.
And let me note here, there are some questions to the City of Monterey as to when the city will implement the Mills Act. So that might be noted.
Just when they do, I think also Long Beach is a good model to use for the Mills Act. They have, I think, the most successful program in the state. The difficulty with the Mills Act is getting the county to cooperate. Most of the financial loss over the 10-year life of the contract, and it can be renewed for another 10 years, is at the county level, and it takes a lot of staff energy to get these things processed and get the county to accept them, as it does for the staff to write the contract and to monitor the work over the 10-year period. The other question about fee waivers, those are all decisions to be decided locally. I think it's useful to canvass different cities and get a menu of what's going on in different places and then choose the ones that work well for each jurisdiction.
Yeah, I'd just jump in briefly. Yes, building permit fees have been waived and reduced in many communities across the country. Sales tax, local sales tax on building products purchased for renovation has been rebated in several communities. Those are small financial gains, but they can be very meaningful. And in many cases, for residential property owners, it isn't necessarily the the amount of the dollars, but the gesture. I actually believe that the most valuable incentive to residential property owners is technical assistance, which is helping them find the craftspeople who know how to do the work, or helping them determine what the appropriate material or procedure is to use, as much as it is giving them financial rebates.
Again, that's a difficult role for a city to take on because it has the sanction of the city steering work to individual contractors and craftspeople. What we've tried to do in Pasadena is use Pasadena Heritage as a conduit for those kinds of questions, but that is useful to have that mostly in the hands of a private group. We can give out several names, but still has the stamp of the favoritism from the city.
All right, thank you. Another question, what are the disadvantages in having a downtown National Historic District that is not also a city historic district?
Would you read it again?
The disadvantages in having a downtown National Historic District that is not also a city historic district.
Let me tell you, National District doesn't do you diddly, except qualifies you for getting the federal tax credits, and that's all on the positive side. There are no restrictions, no limitations, no nothing that the National District does. So to have, frankly, in terms of value enhancement, it doesn't do anything except to the extent it gets you into the tax credit. So if there's a disadvantage on a composite basis, it is the disadvantage of not having the local district to create that kind of carrots and sticks as a whole. But in terms of, is there a disadvantage of having a national and non-local, only the foregone opportunity of the benefits that the local would bring.
Just quickly, I disagree with that. I would give the example of the FEMA grant, which I mentioned, the $45 million grant, which will, we have 26 applications in from Pasadena for that. It's only because we had properties listed in the register, and there are occasionally other grant opportunities like that. I think it also, there's an awareness, a sense of civic pride, the area being in a national registered district, but it's useful to couple that with local designation at the same time.
I was just going to say the only other advantage, although if you are a plow owner, there is diddly at least, is that if you are a national register district for commercial purposes, people put it on their brochures and their material to help make them sound more important, and that sometimes may give you a little bit of an oof, but I think it's only slightly more than diddly.
We're getting very close to running out of time, so I apologize to those who did not have their personal question raised here and encourage you to do it during the reception or subsequently with your respective city. But let me take one other set of questions. And as an educator, I'd like to close with this. There are many questions asked on some kind of education outreach, how it should be done, how it might be done, what recommendations there are. For example, it seems that to have success at the community level, local agencies and/or organizations involved with promoting historical preservation need to develop strategies for involving the general public in the process. Has Monterey developed, and I'm assuming we're going to ask that of Carmel and Pacific Grove too, we don't want to just pick on Monterey here. Has Monterey developed any type of strategic plan to engage, educate, and involve general citizens in the process of doing surveys, developing policy for local historic preservation goals? That's one. In other words, how can the public be reached? How can the citizens be encouraged to participate? Another question, have you any suggestions on how to get to those that don't get it and in 20 years or less? Another similar, as a homeowner of a 70-year-old home on Spaghetti Hill, how can we educate residential property owners in an understandable manner about the benefits of a historic or conservation district? And there are several others like that. How do we reach the public? How do we educate the staff? How do we educate the residents?
I want to take the first one at that, and it's not a how-to question that others are better answered than I. And this will make some preservationist friends probably angry in here. But I think across the country, and I don't know enough about these three communities, so I don't mean that. Across the country, I would suggest to you in both residential and commercial local districts that are being formed. They are formed not because some city council member decided, well, today I think this is a good idea, and draws up an ordinance and passes the district. I think it's a Today, the districts that are getting created around the country are those that follow diligent, both education and one-on-one explanation of what it means and what it doesn't mean. When all of a sudden, the kind of thing becomes, the proposed ordinance comes before the council, that is where good people and bad all of a sudden get real straight-backed about, you're not going to be telling me what I can do with my property, kind of nonsense attitude. And that's going to happen when we don't, the preservation ordinances get turned down or don't ever get considered when in fact people, the limit of people's fear about what it's going to mean outweighs what it means at all. But again, that is the responsibility, it seems to me, of those promoting the ordinance, be that voluntary preservationists or a preservation commission or a city, to spend the time going forward before it gets to that formal process to say, here's what it means, here, more importantly, here's what it doesn't mean, and here's the kind of both carrots and sticks that come along with it. The second thing I think is one of the great stories in America, and in a contentious situation, I think it's a credible alternative to be pondered, and that is the situation in lower downtown in Denver that is one of the great urban revitalization stories in America today. And 10 years ago, or 12, when there was, after a couple of years of diligent effort, a proposal to create a local historic district in lower downtown in Denver. There were property owners that said it's going to make the values go down, you're going to limit what I can do to an unacceptable degree, it's going to be a taking, you're going to wreck my business. And even though it's mostly empty warehouses, this stringent resistance on the part of property owners. Preservationists, however, had made a long-term diligent case, and so they went to the council and made this as a compromise. Okay, we'll tell you what we'll do. Put in the historic district with like a sunset clause that 5 years from now, we're going to have independent third party look at what's happened economically in that district. And if in fact these worst fears of the property owners have come to pass, the district will be evaporated. Well, 5 years later, the study was done. Denver, lower downtown Denver, was the only neighborhood, commercial neighborhood in Denver, in fact, that appreciated in value over that time. With 141 new businesses in the first year. It was an incredible success story. But it was one of those kind of everybody from Missouri show me first kind of deals that they said, all right, we'll do it on a kind of tentative basis because we just don't think those worst case fears would come about. And it's a great, there wouldn't be, can't remotely imagine a property owner today in lower downtown that would go to the city and say, oh, let's get rid of that historic district now. That's been real the salvation there.
Any other suggestions on education, outreach?
I can suggest that I have a friend, Ginny Graves, who runs an organization called CUBE for the Center for Urban and Built Environment in St. Louis. And she goes around the country working primarily with 10 and under school kids, teaching them about the built environment, and they do games and so on, and it's wildly popular. Her view is that you give up on anybody over 20 or 25, and, which is not a bad idea, and actually put all of your effort every year into the young kids, because they are the ones that are going to be the decision makers. And I think if you look at most Europeans' attitude to their built environment and their historic resources, it's very different than our attitude, and a lot of that has to do with the educational system.
I might add, I think in a general term, each community has its own historical society. Pacific Grove has theirs. Monterey has a Monterey History and Arts Association, who have been around a long time and are creating this information, putting out this information, and maintaining that interest among the general public for the history of the area. I think as a good example, specifically on property values, I think Pacific Grove is an excellent example of what's happening to property values there. A listing, as I understand, lasts 4 days in that town, and the property values are perhaps per square foot about as high as anything on the peninsula because of the community and the way it's retained or maintained its Victorian appearance.
If I would add something here, I've got a plaque that hangs on my wall that somebody gave me many years ago. I was a lot younger then and didn't quite believe it, but it says something like, good judgment comes from experience, experience comes from bad judgment. I would say that if you really want to find out how not to do a program, you might call the city of Palo Alto, who's gone through the throes of this, and has been just the thing that Don has talked about didn't occur, and the property owners weren't informed adequately, and there was this great uncertainty, and that's been a very, very bad taste in mouth left up there.
Yeah. I would stress also that property owners need to be brought into the process as early on as possible, and I think it's not just the preservation community that's important as an interested party, but the property owners throughout the designation process, the development of an ordinance. Those things need to be workable for the property owners, and if consensus can be built from day one, the program will be more successful.
All right, I think on that note, we can bring the question and answer session to a conclusion, and of course the questions and answers will go on out in the community. Thank you all for your wonderful participation.
Let's give CARM a big round of applause. To put something like this together, there were three great staffs. The City of Monterey, City of Carmel by the Sea, and Pacific Grove, and some of those staffs are here. Would you folks stand up so we can give you a big round of applause? Stand up, don't be bashful now, where are you? Thank you very much for a job well done. And then just another big applause for all of these participants during the day. They were outstanding. Thank you very much. I'm supposed to wrap this up to show you how we measure historical significance in the city of Monterey. If you noticed up here when our folks were showing you some slides, they were showing you a slide of Larkin School Bridge. That is an old bridge that connects one of our streets to the high school area there. That's a primary focus these days on historical preservation because my wife and myself went to school there, and there was a very historical event that happened on that bridge. So I'm just kidding, okay? But anyway, thank you all for being here. When we're talking about a wrap-up, I think the wrap-up should be outside in that the wrap-up of some food, and I think there might be some wine. And let's thank those people again, Cannery Row Monterey, the Cannery Row Company, the Monterey Commercial Property Owners Association, and the Monterey Plaza Hotel for the refreshments that'll be outside. Thanks all of you for attending. It's been a good day. Thank you.